And as you can hear, this webinar is going to be recorded and we'll put this up on our website. Thank you so much for joining. This, as you know, is our monthly Data for Peace dialogue. And this is a space that we hold, really on the last Tuesday of every month to highlight some of the leading edge approaches to data-driven methods for prevention and peace building. So next month, we're actually going to put this on pause for a month because we have two other events coming up. Next week, we're going to be at the Stockholm Forum. I know that many of you will also be there. We'll be hosting a panel called Friend or Foe, Emerging Technologies and Conflict Early Warning in the Age of Compound Risk. So that's going to be next Tuesday on May 5th from 1 to 2 Eastern Time, or 7 to 8 Central European Time if you're in Europe or Africa. Also, we're just about to open registration for our own international workshop that's happening the week of May 18th, and it's going to be on early warning, early response. We have an incredible lineup of more than 40 organizations who will be speaking at this conference. It's going to be a mix of thought-provoking panel discussions, short 30-minute pitches on innovative approaches, as well as capacity building workshops on data-driven tools. So please do look in your email boxes soon for registration information. So let's get started for today. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Miranda Sissons, who is the Director of Human Rights at Facebook. And I do believe she is their first such director, and she's undoubtedly part of a kind of small wave of human rights activists who've joined the tech sector and big tech companies trying to influence change from the inside. Now, Miranda previously held leadership roles at Doctors of the World USA, at Purpose, which you may know of as the online mobilization platform, at the International Center for Transitional Justice. And this is after having worked at Human Rights Watch for many years, as well as other posts. So Miranda joined Facebook in August 2019, I think really at a moment when many observers had maybe lost hope that Facebook could find ways of harmonizing the tension between its business imperative on the one hand with human rights protections on the other. So whether that's remediating harms created through the platform or preventing such harms in the first place. And I think we're all aware of the mountain of critique that Facebook received, for example, for hate-fueled violence across 2017 in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, as well as other instances. And since then, these difficulties in harmonizing these tensions have continued to be on display, both in my country here, the United States, and other places around the world. But the company has really deepened existing initiatives and newly created a number of things to rein in these trends. And Miranda's going to talk about those with us today. So these include its oversight board, its new human rights policy, and the ongoing investments that it's been making in improving its analytics to identify harmful content, as well as to try to also identify hotspots for potential offline violence. So with that, I would love to hand it over to Miranda for her remarks, and really, again, appreciate all of you joining today. The Q&A is open. Please feel free to start posting questions. Miranda.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you everyone for being here. It's exciting to be able to speak, and I look forward to your questions, acknowledging that everything I say represents probably the worst of all possible work in the worst of all ways to tackle some of the world's worst problems, because this is all tough stuff, but being tough is no excuse not to try to do your best. So I think one way I could maybe start the conversation is to talk briefly about Facebook's human rights policy that we released on March 16, and use that as a frame to also kind of provide you with an overview of other elements that Paige mentioned. So I might take about 10 or 15 minutes to talk about the policy, and then happy to open up But as Paige noted, I joined Facebook in August 2019 after a long career in human rights and in tech. And that's partly because I thought this dreadful collision between tech companies and human rights harms that we saw in Myanmar, but also elsewhere, meant that people really had to lead in, or the people who had any element of skill in tech, really that this was a time where we had to try and use our skills to lift all boats and to fight for better protections, which is why I'm here. So I am the inaugural director of human rights at Facebook. I have a funny accent because I'm originally from Australia, although I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and have worked to protect human rights in various places around the globe. Facebook released a human rights policy in March 2021, about a decade after the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were actually released. That's a very important step, and I want people to understand it as an action step, not just a policy, because it's another step on a journey that Facebook truly began in 2013, when, as a tech company, it joined a multi-stakeholder initiative made up of companies in social media, in communications, in other forms of tech, along with NGOs, along with academics, called the Global Network Initiative. The GNI is quite an important part of this story. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative that arose in particular in a response to a human rights crisis triggered by Yahoo, that was the dominant player at that time, and where Yahoo had disclosed the personal data of an activist to the Chinese authority that led to the detention and imprisonment of that activist in a very high-profile case. And so a group of companies got together and others and formed the Global Network Initiative, where companies promised to protect and to implement protections for freedom of expression and privacy as defined in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And Facebook joined that in 2013 and thus has fairly strong protections operationally and legally for protecting freedom of expression and privacy from arbitrary government requests. However, in the years that followed, it expanded rapidly as a platform, and indeed tech and social media made its way to many parts of our lives, until we had the really incredible and to some extent not unexpected low point of watching atrocity crimes unfold in Myanmar, and the resulting human rights impact assessment, which Facebook, to its credit, published in full, but recommended Facebook improve, amongst many other practical steps, its leadership and understanding of the human rights framework. When I came on board as a result of that HRA and began building a small but mighty team, we pursued a show not tell strategy of human rights action. And so since 2019, you will have seen that as a result of a number of company processes, not just the human rights team, there has been the creation of the Facebook Independent Oversight Board that is a form of remedy and accompanied by a fully public human rights impact assessment to provide remedy for users on content takedown and decisions. We have released human rights due diligence and insights and actions and responses to that due diligence in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Indonesia. We voluntarily disclosed data to the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and taken other action steps to show not tell action on human rights. So the release of the policy in March is another such step. And in essence, its framework is determined a bit by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And they're the extremely unexciting glue that glue businesses to international treaties, which is mainly about states. And under the UNGPs, they say, okay, companies, if you're serious about this, you have to state that you're going to seek to respect the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And you have to outline your policy, you have to give us an outline of your policy and implementation work in certain specific areas. So if I just briefly go over our human rights policy, first of all, doing it was a very active process of collaboration with many, many internal teams. But in fact, the whole policy is itself well aligned with Facebook's mission. I'm very fortunate in my job that Facebook's mission of giving people the power to build community and bring the world closer together is essentially inherently about supporting and empowering people to exercise their human rights, not just freedom of expression, but also many other rights. And the policy that we released is company-wide. So it's important to understand it's not just about the Facebook app, the blue app that is so famous, but it's also all other elements of Facebook, the company. That includes public social media tools such as Instagram, also private messaging tools such as Messenger and WhatsApp, as well as workplace tools like Workplace and hardware like Oculus. It's a policy that covers all company activity and personnel that serves something like 3 billion monthly active users, and where we have 100 billion pieces of user-generated content at play daily, where we work in over 100 languages, and 87% of our users are outside North America. The key elements of the policy are, we state a broad and strong framework through which we will respect human rights. Now that's important. States have an obligation to protect human rights, obviously honored in the breach rather than in the action. Companies' duties are different. Their jobs are to respect human rights or more or less to avoid violating human rights themselves. In our policy, we seek to craft a broad and strong framework for respect by recognizing much more than the minimum set of standards. Companies have a minimum set they're supposed to acknowledge, and we do more. We seek to recognize not just the International Bill of Human Rights and ILO Declaration, but also the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the rights of the child, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and certain regional instruments. And we also, you'll see in there, are seeking to build a unified framework for civil rights and racial justice work. So that's definitely a policy element that we've sought deliberately to put in there. We have a pretty complicated look at existing framework avenues for implementation, where we talk not just about our content policies, right, which is what most people think of when they think about human rights in Facebook, but we also talk about our responsible innovation team, our responsible AI teams, diversity and inclusion, our law enforcement guidelines and data disclosure policies, our privacy commitments, our supply chain program, our transparency reporting, and our GNI membership, just to name a few. We recognize, and this again builds from the UNGPs, that Facebook, unlike many other companies, has a very broad range of salient, that means important, human rights risks and opportunities across its operation. The company's roles are to do human rights risk management, to know and to show the world that they know their salient human rights risks, to prioritize those risks according to the criteria that UNGP roll out. And indeed, that's crucial for Facebook because we are so large and because there is such a wide variety of salient risks. Prioritization is crucial. And then having done those risk management exercises to ensure that we mitigate and prevent those risks, prioritizing those that have the widest, the most salient based on a framework that involves the number of people, the severity of the harm, its remediability, and the proximity of its link to Facebook, to the business. So this is all about the human rights work, and human rights policy at Facebook is all about seeking to translate these principles into practice and to mitigate and prevent. Because if you remember, we are user-generated content. Social media is about users and about systems, where these systems may be built to support or accidentally to violate rights. And these users may be seeking to express, empower, or violate rights. And that means that it's a very wide field of action and field of risk. The policy is interesting in a couple of areas in particular. Facebook tries to, in its policy, state the different kinds of tools we use to know and manage our human rights risks. We also commit to doing a report annually that shares the insights and actions that we have from our human rights due diligence, which is something that at the moment, very few companies do. We will be iterating. I expect it will be a fairly simple report for its first take, but we also realize that this is an initiative that needs to be practical and also to grow, to deliver value to others. And we're seeking there to build on our recent history of fairly unusual transparency in this space. We talk about the remedies that we offer to users. We offer not just self-remedy options through our UX interfaces or in design and features, such as, for example, user blocking or message forwarding limits. But we also talk about access to appeal and the current impact that COVID has on that appeal system, and also on the creation of the Oversight Board, which was specifically designed as a remedy mechanism consistent with the UN Guiding Principles. We talk about governance, oversight, and accountability. And it's important to know that this policy has leadership at the highest level of the company. Nick Clegg, our VP of Global Policy and Communications, and Jennifer Newstead, our General Counsel Legal, where we are reporting human rights issues periodically and formally to our board of directors. So the proof of the pudding about this is all about implementation, and we know that. But I think there are three elements that should ideally give people some room for optimism that this is meant as a thoughtful and ambitious framework. The first is the breadth and strength of the rights that we recognize. This is not just us talking about freedom of expression, but also recognizing discrimination and the rights of the child, the rights of women, racial equality, a very broad set of rights. That's unusual. Secondly, the commitment to annual reporting is very unusual. And as I said, we'll need to develop it over time, but we hope that there will be an element of co-design and evolution in there. Third, in addition to the very specific leadership oversight, we also have a section where we speak about the specific risks and needs of human rights defenders. That is, the individuals and organizations that use our platform to advocate for or fulfill global human rights and global human rights principles. We acknowledge the very high risks faced by defenders and the way that they use our platforms. And we state that we'll be seeking to support them in their activism and to mitigate their risks. That essentially takes Facebook's existing focus on activists and journalists and seeks to discipline it and link it to the global human rights framework, but also sets ourselves aspirational goals that are becoming slightly more frequent in company human rights statements, but are still pretty unusual. I'll stop there. The team is currently working on implementation strategies. We do already do a wide variety of human rights risk management, ranging from traditional human rights impact assessments to decision support, because the mission of our team, which is a team based in the policy team, not in legal, is that we exist to support decision makers around the company, wherever they're located, make decisions to support and respect human rights. We have our P0, that means our top priority at the moment, is to seek to minimize the misuse of the platform to organize or incite atrocity crimes. And we're active in several product work streams around the world. But we also do multiple other forms of due diligence and risk management across the entire company. I'll stop there and I'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Miranda. May I just ask you a quick question before we go over to Branka, which is, I think you've done a really wonderful job in giving the broad overview of the human rights policy how it's trying to line Facebook up with norms which are different from the business imperatives. So what do you see as what you hope or intend to be the practical effect of this? Let's say 2 years from now, which is a long time in Facebook terms. What would be different in terms of the practice at Facebook, hopefully as a result of this policy?
A couple of different things, and it's a really good question. First of all, it's a very specific linkage of company norms and values and mission to a global human rights framework, and thus introducing the possibility of greater discipline, greater global knowledge, greater global norm shaping of that framework. So first and foremost, obviously, this is meant to say, yes, we do have a human rights policy. Yes, we do recognize globally defined human rights. No, we're not going to argue this based on first principles. So that connection is really important, both for our leadership, but also for our staff, right? Because from this, we can educate about human rights norms, and we can find the most practical way to bring risk management and rights respecting due diligence into action. We already do quite a lot of that. So by the end of 2 years' time, I'd like our research teams on the product side and our UX designers to have harm severity frameworks and mitigation frameworks that are consciously aligned to rights principles, building on the existing frameworks we have around prioritization of at-risk countries today, which are already well aligned to the UNGPs. I'm delighted to say, and well as experimenting with various other forms of guidance. I would like our content policy writers and our public policy teams to be well trained, not just in basics of human rights, but how human rights can be supported and protected in their everyday work in the field. And I would like us to have built up a solid body of action and decision-making that conspicuously refers to specific human rights principles in their decision-making, not just in private, which happens quite a lot. We do escalations every day related to human rights norms, but also in our public reporting. People may already have seen signs of that in for example, in recent media statements on Myanmar, on Thailand, on West African elections, on due diligence for COVID, and even in some congressional testimony. I would like that to be expanded so that it is clear that we are walking a walk and talking a talk, because both are important. But whether or not we can achieve that change within 2 years, I don't know. And I would always prioritize the practical above the rhetorical.
Wonderful. So Branka, let's go over to you now for some reflections. And please, everybody, any questions you have in the chat, and also feel free to ask, I would say, even very basic questions. There may even be questions about where Miranda's position is located within Facebook and how that affects kind of the relationship with other departments she's referencing, like product and so forth, which I think is important. But Branka, over to you.
Thank you, Paige. Exactly. I wanted to say the same thing. There's so many questions, Miranda, that we want to ask you. So I will just be brief, more in giving some reflections about our own programming as well, and connecting this with the mission of Facebook and the new human rights policy that you gave. But first, to say that it's really great to see that Facebook is not only recognizing the importance of human rights with adopting this human rights policy framework, but also recognizing the importance of expertise. As you said, the first practical step of bringing this commitment to practice is actually forming your own team and bringing you to the team. So it's great to see that we actually have a person from the human rights field joining Facebook. And I think, Miranda, many will say that you may be one of the bravest experts as well, coming into Facebook and actually taking all of these challenges into your hands and the hands of your team. I remember reading one of the very first interviews, I think, when you started doing this or started this position, it was your interview with Bloomberg that actually said that the new Facebook's human rights director will have a role of confronting all Facebook's past sins. So I found this as a very big challenge, but it's really, really great to hear all of the work that has been done and that you're planning to do in the future. So I will try to put this discussion now in the framework of overarching topic of this webinar series, as Paige introduced the introduction, and not only this webinar series, but the entire NYU CIC program, and that is data for peace, or more concretely, data-driven approaches to peace building and prevention. So discussion with Facebook, this is how we title the session today, and discussion about Facebook can have hundreds of different angles, and we are just being aware that we have less than a half an hour now to discuss this. So I wanted to help maybe frame the discussion and give also time to our audience to give some and pose some questions. So when we think about Facebook and its role in peace and human rights discussion from our own field, from peace building field, usually this discussion goes in this direction of misinformation or hate speech or violence incitement, and this is extreme, and this is why, while preparing the session with Miranda, we wanted to start with presenting the latest in the series of instruments Facebook adopted to tackle some of these problems. But I wanted to suggest to maybe think about two other angles, not only to our audience, but also to Miranda and Facebook, how to have this dialogue, as we are calling this webinar series. So the first one is recognizing that with many emerging challenges to peace in the digital age and social media age, there are also many emerging opportunities to transform conflict with digital technologies. And although, as I said, it's sometimes hard to see anything except the hate speech, and sometimes we hear even those cases of recruitment for terrorism, fake news, of course, disinformation campaigns, privacy is a big issue in this field, and other challenges to peaceful societies. The fact is that peace builders have also been able to, and human rights defenders, of course, have been able to tap into this online communities where they create open and inclusive spaces to share knowledge and to create partnerships and to establish networks and motivate for peaceful action. And I'm saying this partially connecting this with Miranda's background as well, and your work in the human rights field in Egypt. And we know how this entire social media sphere was used in the Arab Spring and so on, as you mentioned many times. It actually gave voices often to people who lost those voices in authoritarian regimes. So just to mention at this point, and I will actually use a quote here from one of the reports that says, technological innovation has been a powerful democratizing force which has opened new avenues and spaces for civic participation, collective action, empowering marginalized voices, and enhancing local accountability. And this is the quote I'm using for the report called Digital Pathways for Peace. This report is published by Peace Direct. And I'm doing this because I want to bring into this discussion voices of many peace builders, often grassroots organizations that are out there. So this was the collective consultation, online consultation process of more than 60 peace builders across the world that actually shared their stories of how digital technologies provided them as peace builders are even alternative infrastructures for peace, which was especially visible in with the start of pandemic and lockdowns and so on. So this is just the first potential avenue how we can have this discussion. The second one I would like us to take into the discussion is actually the one that NYU-CSC is intensively working on for previous couple of years, actually, through gathering and building a community of practice, with creating this space for sharing lessons learned and building capacities of actors in this data for peace field. So working with practitioners in this field, what we are often witnessing is not only the larger access to social media, and Miranda just mentioned really fascinating numbers of 3 billion monthly active users only on Facebook, and 100 different languages. So what we saw in our field is practitioners having an access to all of these materials that are published on social media and to content that is available. Also, we see an increased access to different literature, research, even tools on analyzing social media, including advancement in natural language, called social listening or sentiment analysis. So we are even seeing some organizations in our field experimenting with automated social media analysis, and the ability to analyze thousands and thousands of comments and quantify those reactions. We see a possibility of quantifying topic of conversations, as I said, different sentiments and so on. So what I would like us to think and maybe discuss in this conversation is also, can these advancements on the technology side, or how these advancements can potentially help peace builders, human rights protectors, peacemakers, even conflict mediators in their work? And what can we learn about a conflict context, for example, from social media? Can we learned anything? We already started this discussion while preparing for the session with Miranda. What is all the noise out there? Is it only the noise, or we can actually have some signals out there that we can use as peace builders, even for early action, for early warning, and make sure to reach early action, make sure that conflicts don't escalate into violence. And I would like to maybe start the discussion around some of these issues with Miranda and see what Facebook's or Miranda's opinions about these are. I know that often we have different discussions and different opinions in the nonprofit or government sector, and on the side of the platforms themselves, what are actually the potentials of utilizing these tools. So this is my short 5 minutes, just brief contribution to try to connect this really important human rights framework and other tools that Miranda was talking about, and see how we can utilize this and connect it to the peace building field, and of course data for peace program.
Great, thanks, Branka. So you've posed I think a question to Miranda, really about kind of positive elements of Facebook. We also have a cascade of questions in the Q&A. So I want to ask Miranda, do you want to respond briefly to Branka, and I'll try to organize the questions? Or do you want to just go into it?
Sure. Well, I'll just give a view, one kind of preliminary question, or one kind of preliminary observation. First of all, every aspect of human behavior that exists offline exists online, right? So every aspect of human behavior is online, and it's important to acknowledge that. Some of the elements of human behavior are probably easy to mitigate or remedy, and others are not. The other thing is, we are really in the kind of second decade of the internet, now beginning the third. And the early advantage mover that the forces of good, as it were, held, that we saw, young activists and young open-minded people advocating for a free and open internet, advocating for and using tools to promote freedom of expression, political participation, redress discrimination. That early mover advantage has ended, right? And we are now in a decade where everyone is increasingly able to mobilize these tools both for good or for bad, but increasingly governments and authoritarian figures are engaging in adversarial and sophisticated uses of the internet. And I mean, the entire internet, not just Facebook. So that's, I think, an important, I never realized that as strongly until I took this job, where I was completely surprised by the degree of old-fashioned freedom of expression and defense of human rights work that, was bread and butter, I think, of human rights activism in the 1990s or in the 1960s or in the 1970s, but really was less strongly pronounced in the toolkit in the first decade and a half of this century. Secondly, there's so life inside a giant platform looks a lot like life outside. It's very noisy. There's all kinds of magic signals that might be there, but you can't necessarily pick them up, or they may be there, but you can't understand them, or maybe it's nothing, or there's a mistake in the data and it's bad data. And, we do run the most positive use of data that I have found and applauded when I came on board, because I'd also participated in the NYU CIC first workshop on data for peace building, was quantitative modeling using conflict prevention experts to use about 60 different empirical external sources, leveraged with some digital penetration and event factors, to try and prioritize countries for investment to prevent the risk of widespread conflict or atrocity crimes. And we use that system every 6 months. We've now updated it in certain aspects to also look at specific indicators of risk for transition between intensity risk in what can be quite prolonged periods of instability. That is a very productive, I think, investment guidance, risk mitigation guidance tool. That is something that I'm very excited to work with and is well aligned with human rights principles. But it's not a secret source, all right? And the whole theory that words lead to actions, or words will help us predict actions, I'm not, at the moment, all I see is a very fuzzy screen in that environment at the moment. But let me stop there and go for other questions.
Fantastic. So I've organized a few things here. So we have a number of questions that are, for example, about competing imperatives within Facebook, and incentives really around bad actors, which may not be a term that you use, Miranda. But Yared had a question about the presence of incentives for Facebook to ensure the unintended use of the platform. And by that, I think he means, the negative effects of the platform. And then Phil also had a question about what happens when human rights concerns come into conflict with Facebook's profit or business model. And I think there have been some news stories about that in the past. So that kind of set of issues about the competing imperatives and how these policies are kind of dealing with that.
Yeah, it's important to drive, I guess, the questions to like specificity. I think with the first question, I mean, people use technologies in a gazillion ways that you don't intend when you release it. And I think is not that one can predict the use, but that one can identify harmful uses or unintended consequences with profound negative effect and seek to mitigate that harm, right? So for example, by far the most profoundly negative use and user experience on Facebook is spam and porn, two things which nobody has mentioned here, whereas the global prevalence of hate speech is like 8 out of 10,000 views, right? So it is important to actually have a pretty detail-oriented but pretty broad image of what harm can be when we're speaking about this, because the behaviors that people use to manipulate peace processes are often obviously available and used well prior to the invention of the internet, but can act with different velocity and with different impact and different speed using these tools. And the other thing is to fundamentally remember that this is user generated. We don't have a general filtering or scanning system in place. We do not see what is out there, right? We're not allowed to see what is out there, but we can and have gotten much better at developing and deploying proactive detection for hate speech and certain policy violating areas of speech and nudity and graphic violence. And we can at times go after specific harms in specific contexts with a very narrow focus. But as I mentioned earlier, this is all about prioritization, the limits of innovation, right? So 5 years ago, Facebook could detect 0 hate speech proactively on Facebook. These days, I believe we proactively detect and route for moderation something like 97% of all hate speech that we bring down, right? And it has taken immense natural language processing, classified development, labeling capacity, outsourced labeling capacity to develop that in only 22 languages, right? Or however many languages we do. And so a lot of what we want to do, the techniques aren't there yet. Or it's such a long tail harm that when you have to evaluate priorities, you may not be able to prioritize it. And that's why, in fact, the greatest challenge for me as a human rights defender in Facebook is not persuading people that something is harmful. It's to prioritize and translate insight into action and say, no, this is what is the top priority now. This is the top priority for the next 18 months. This is how we at scale move to mitigate this harm and to help people believe it's possible, right? Because that's what we don't know. We're all on the bounds of possibility here.
Yeah, and I think that's getting into another set of questions that we have, which I've grouped under a heading of kind of practical approaches to prevention, and maybe stemming from Asa's question about, okay, so great, and other questions. So there's a human rights policy now, but what does that mean for more preventive approaches? So Christina, for example, is asking about a sense of lack of clarity around the feed algorithm and our methods evolving to do more prediction. Eduardo is asking about, past instances in Sri Lanka and the problem of lack of language skills and the extent to which Facebook has adopted new practices for that. And I know that you have. David has been asking about implicit bias and ways that you might be detecting that. And then Asa about conflict sensitivity. So not just sort of an ex post approach to this, but more proactive ways of understanding what drivers of conflict are. And maybe that's not really Facebook's responsibility, but is there a direction that this is heading in?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, when tech people talk about integrity, right, and there are mindless press releases about civic integrity or platform integrity, these are the harms people are talking about. And the research and the design and the co-design and the policy work, which often is actually less influential than the product work, are all about understanding, researching, quantifying, and mitigating such risks. So if you see on the Facebook newsroom, for example, it's fairly impenetrable language, but you see we've posted specifically about work we've done protect elections in Myanmar, in West Africa, the program we have on social media and conflict, a lot of the work on election integrity in the US. One of the reasons why these newsroom posts are so hard to understand, quite apart from the fact that you're always required to speak in corporate press release language, is that the technical, you work to mitigate very specific problems, because it's by breaking them up into specific problems that you make them actionable. So for example, I think if I go back to the broader example about business, what happens with the business interests. First of all, Facebook is a business, but it's the tail and the dog thing. Its business is largely to power the expression and community, right? And that is fairly seriously taken across the company. So this is certainly the easiest place, not the most simple, but the easiest place where people that I have ever worked in for people to grasp and be motivated by human rights concerns. The challenge comes in disciplining them and translating them into insight. There obviously are times at which profit motivations and human rights concerns clash. That's specifically about content is where it comes, and also probably about advertising, which because it's regulated speech, not organic content, largely comes under a different set of human rights rules. And some of those rules haven't been written yet, and everybody, this whole world, is in the process, I think, of articulating them. But it's important to know that it is in Facebook's interest to have a positive user experience. It is in Facebook's interest to promote the growth of conditions under which small and medium businesses can thrive. It's in Facebook's interest to do an excellent job of keeping spam off the system, right, which it does. And when we can get to certain misinformation and certain other violations, it's equally in our interest. So I think it's important to drive that question to more specific. I think that easy take, well, if it's not of its interest, it won't do it. Well, actually, its interests are quite diverse. And one is able to manage magnificent human rights work, or else we wouldn't have gotten as far as we have, right? On Sri Lanka, on the learning that's taken place since 2017, yes, that's exactly the right question, is the growth in the operational. It's not about the tech, it's not about the policy, as much as it's about the operational capacity to respond to, predict, and manage risk, right, in the riskiest environments. There have been significant investments there, and I commend folks to read the Facebook response to the Sri Lanka HRIA, where we give a very specific and factual kind of outline of some of those responses, which have included changes to the main newsfeed algorithm. And be aware here, we're dealing with thousands of different pieces of machine learning to prioritize content from close social connections, right? We also have pioneered machine learning and algorithmic work to downrank and lessen the virality of likely hate speech that hasn't been reviewed by a moderator, but can route that speech to a moderator. That's probably the most significant mitigation that we have been able to engineer in 5 years that has a huge impact on people's experience of the platform and on hate speech around the world. I'm losing so greater conflict sensitivity, I think, is becoming built in, but it needs to be built in across product, across operations, and across policy. On policy, you can see frameworks like the misinformation and real world harm policy that was introduced as a result of Sri Lanka, and specifically the Candy riots and allegations that people were sterilizing other people by introducing sterilization pills in their food. If you look at our content policy frameworks, that includes misinformation, real world harm, unverifiable rumors, veiled threats, a pretty elaborate hate speech framework, you will see that there is a fair amount of policy work that is done and has been done in the last 3 years, and an almost infinite amount remains. And there are very real underlying disagreements, even within the human rights community, about the contours of that policy, which is why it's so important that we have the oversight board, as well as systems of virtual and productive friction to generate change in all aspects of the company. I'll stop there because I think I'm missing out on a lot of things.
I am trying to reference all the questions. Let's see if I will succeed. So another category I have is around cooperation with civil society. So we have Anuradha, who makes the point that, in her view, a framework like this can work in some countries, but works less well in others, maybe with more autocratic forms of governance. And what is Facebook doing to ensure that the good actors, the activists and journalists aren't being taken down? But kind of on the flip side, in a more positive way, and maybe linking back to Branka's comments, Neil is asking about, he's asking about internal collaboration at Facebook, how well that works on these kinds of issues, but also, again, how does the collaboration with civil society work? And I know that, again, is something that Facebook has been working on very actively in the past few years.
Yeah, I sit there at this edge of this vast, infinite continent of teeming people trying to work out how to influence, how to command, how to inspire. And of course, inspiration and motivation potentially have the most leverage because they can ripple through tens of thousands of people. So a lot of the challenges, internal coordination, are not dissimilar to working in any other tech company, which are all famous for a very strong horizontal coordination burden. And here it's important to recognize that there are real strengths in working in an agile software development environment, which is you need to ship code every hour of every day, right? So you have teams who are self-motivated, well-organized, usually well-structured, who need to get stuff done every minute of other day. And if they have a disagreement about something that is going to block a timely release, they can escalate it quickly up their leadership chain. This is tremendously powerful in ensuring that you get day-to-day human rights protection and human rights advocacy. Like people might, people say, oh, what about decision X? And you're like, well, but that might be one of, I don't know, 25 different human rights decisions that leader X needed to make in these 3 hours. I mean, that's the volume, right, that it goes at. But also that you can surface policy decisions or product investments fairly quickly, which in some organizations may take 3 to 5 years. You might be able to get approved or blocked and not continued in 6 to 12 months or less. So that's one powerful thing about this environment, where the difficulties of horizontal coordination are similar to the UN, but the ability to initiate action is perhaps in some ways far quicker. In terms of civil society inputs, these are very valuable, right? And I think they're recognized as such, which was a pleasant surprise. There's a lot of noise about the fact that when you work at scale, if somebody comes to you with 3 cases of something and you're dealing with millions of cases a week, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything, right? But where the joined up voices of people who are very concerned about issue X or have insight about cases, very severe cases in country X, really do add a great deal of value. So the 3 main, I think, ways to illustrate how we do that is, first of all, in developing the content policies. Our policies in a tech company have basically a standard framework for iteration. It's not that you pass one rule and you spend 5 years and you don't look at it, but in general, there's a cycle to update and refresh, particularly because your enforcement capacities are improving all the time. So we have a specific stakeholder engagement framework with defined principles, a staff team that seek to consult global stakeholders, which is broadly defined, is global and includes civil society, academics, and others, up to about 80 different organizations or experts for each policy change, right? So that's an ongoing cycle and why that covers globally and does ensure that we have a very diverse range of inputs for policy development. Second of all, we have our Trusted Partner Program, which I think now is around about 300 or more organizations around the globe who are trained and have reporting access to special tools related to their ability to prioritize content for moderation or flag misinformation or conflict risks in certain environment. The participants are confidential, we don't name them, but they include many, many local organizations and some global organizations. And is something that has developed well. COVID has had a severe impact on our ability to take on new folks, but that is a very strong way we get daily casework and input, as well as more consistent feedback, as well as, of course, from our third-party fact-checking partners and others who are also often nonprofits or journalists. Finally, we also have product insights. Co-design is maybe the strongest tool we have. Our UX research teams and our co-design teams present some of the strongest work that we do with civil society and other experts that feed indirectly into how we design features. One example is the locked profile feature. Nobody maybe knows that. We released it in Myanmar 2 weeks ago as a result of, first of all, the at-risk country prioritization work, the targeted user prioritization work, our reactions to the coup. We then shipped a small unheralded feature that prevents accounts from surveillance activities by law enforcement forces, and that a very high number of over 1 million users uploaded in the first couple of days. That is an example of an excellent mitigation that was developed based on ongoing, extensive, close work with civil society and others, not just in Myanmar, but also in India and South Asia, where that feature had originally shipped as an anti-revenge porn device. So I think those are 2 concrete examples. And the realm of work is infinite, right? Because the realm of harm can be pretty infinite, but good concrete work can happen and gives me incredible motivation for the future whenever I see it.
Fantastic, Miranda. So let's close on the last set of questions, which I think is a great way to end, because there are questions about partnership and about even who to contact at Facebook for some people. But how can organizations cooperate? We have a question from Kenya, from Harun, who's asking, about this, from Renato, who's asking about connecting the Libra project. Laura, who's asking about whether Facebook would consider sharing data with the humanitarian community in the way that it does with business site owners. So that, I think, is in the spirit of the Data for Peace dialogues, is maybe ending on a note of cooperation. And how does that happen? Who do people reach out to?
Yeah, and this is a fundamental issue of the one-to-many problem, one Facebook, many, many, many stakeholders, impacted communities, right? So there are a variety of ways, and in fact, almost as disorganized, as incoherent as the UN and global civil society itself, right? So, I mean, what might be best is if people just, if we take the chat and have a look, but in essence, on Data for Good and data with humanitarian communities, we do have a Data for Good project. We also have we have a number of a trial of API institutions. So I would encourage you to look at our Data for Good webpage, or if you're part of the humanitarian community, I can direct you through our humanitarian folks or the UN team. If you are country-based, it's easiest probably to, for example, in Kenya, there is a local Facebook public policy team. There are a variety of folks that you can usually work out from media who are in contact with Facebook that you can get to, or I can direct you. In many countries, we're not there because it's also very risky for the company to actually have a physical footprint in the location, because it often brings with it enhanced censorship and takedown and government compliance risks. So, variety of different ways. Chuck, throw me the messages and I'll try and give, concrete answers to the specific questions, but got to drive that to a level of specificity.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I really was delighted to hear you talk about this very action-oriented policy. And I think, we moved from really understanding the framework to, for me at least, having a very solid understanding of how this can potentially cascade through operations and down to users, and hopefully make a difference in Facebook's practice. Branka, would you like to say any closing words?
Just to thank to Miranda, and thank you so much, Miranda, for joining us. And of course, I would also leave it on this cooperation note page that we just introduced. Now, I think this is a big aim of our program as well, to really open pathways for people to talk with each other and to find ways to be inspired by each other's work. One of the examples that we had in one of Data for Peace dialogues is actually a civil society organization cooperating with Facebook on redirect method, and actually bringing to Facebook vast experience of civil society actors on fighting extremism, for example. So I hope this will be an inspiration for cooperation on both sides. Of course, I would like to thank all of our guests today for their questions, and to remind everybody that we are having this event approaching in May, our workshop, that we will have also a chance to continue this discussion with Facebook in a couple of sessions there. So let's say that this is just the beginning, and then we will see each other again in May.
Fantastic. Thanks, Branka, and big thank you to you, Miranda, for making the time.
Thank you,
I'm
Miranda.
very grateful for the opportunity. I've done a horrible job talking about what I do and what I don't do, but I think the one thing I would say is the ability to always detect what's the biggest problem, the priority, what's the actionable problem, how do we recognize and celebrate action. That's not going to disappear, and it's something I've learned from tech much more than I learned for human rights, but by gosh, it's a powerful tool for human rights, I hope. And that's what I'll be trying to use in the months and years to come.
Great. And thanks to everybody for joining today. Much appreciated. Take care.